Hello, everybody. Thanks for being with us again today. It's great to have you here. It's a beautiful day in Gippsland, but we have joining us today Emeritus Professor Gabriel Moens and Professor Augusto Zimmerman. Welcome, gentlemen, to the program. Welcome to all the people that look forward to these programs and the things that we talk about. If they're followers of Spectator magazine, they'd know you well. But would you tell our audience today a bit of background? We've got to give age precedence here. I'm sorry, Professor Augusto. And we've got to go with Gabriel Moens, Professor Gabriel Moens first. Gabriel, give it to us.
Yes, actually, it was my birthday yesterday, 77. But of course, I work as much as a 25-year-old, so no problem. So my name is Gabriel Moens. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. I'm an adjunct professor at Curtin University and a number of other universities as well, both in Australia and overseas. I have extensively taught at various universities in Europe, Australia, and in the United States, where I spent approximately 6 years. And I'm happy to be here with you today.
Great. Now, Augusto.
All right. I am a law professor. I was for many years honored to be working with Professor Gabriel Moens at Murdoch University. I was Associate Dean for Research. I was also I am a former Law Reform Commissioner with the Law Reform Commission of Western Australia. For a couple of years, I served the Liberal Party as the Senior Vice President, one of the divisions here, until I decided to resign. My letter of resignation was published in The Spectator. I have just left my job as an academic at Sheridan because the project is no longer going ahead. But I have great plans for this nation, and I'm confident that there will be another good academic position for me where I can continue to carry out with my job. Another thing is that I'm editor-in-chief of the Western Australian Law Journal, Western Australian Jurist Law Journal, and the president of the Western Australian Legal Theory Association.
Right. Look, thank you. I want to thank both of you for co-signing my letters to the Prime Minister and Health Minister and the TGA. I got so frustrated writing the letters under my own hand. So I needed people with your expertise, experience, and knowledge in these specific areas to be able to show that the letter wasn't just coming from me, it was coming from people like yourselves around the world. So thank you. As you're aware, a couple of the responses I've received to date have been most unsatisfactory. In fact, one of their letters said that the assertions we made about DNA contamination in the COVID vials constitutes misinformation. I can't believe the stonewalling. They say they're waiting for the so-called right peer-reviewed paper. Why wouldn't they err on the side of caution? What do you think about this pushback? Either of them.
Well, clearly in Australia, we have to favor freedom of speech. And when you speak freely, sometimes the information conveyed to other people will be wrong. Sometimes the information will be right. But it is the marketplace of ideas that is the place where the truth of a statement is to be determined or not. So if somebody makes a decision that a particular statement amounts to misinformation, is misinformation itself, because it prevents people from actively participating in public debates and social debates. So I'm very much in favor of almost unrestricted free speech, because if somebody makes an outrageous statement which possibly can't be true, then the marketplace of ideas will come into effect, and that person who makes the statement will be condemned. So it is not up to some politicians, to some elites to make decisions as to what can be said and what cannot be said. But coming back to your specific question, it is very doubtful that what you have told us constitutes misinformation, because there is no substantive evidence of a scientific nature that indeed there was contamination and that these medicines are not really safe for people to take.
Yep.
Yes, Professor Gabriel Moens and I have exposed these things in our articles. We even have a book that was published into 2022 to alert our society. This book that is Professor Moens is showing. It's called Emergency Powers, COVID-19 Restrictions and Mandatory Vaccination, where we provide in one of the chapters a very comprehensive assessment of the unconstitutionality of these measures. Certainly, we would never, ever have to be forced into coercion and into vaccine mandates, especially if you take into account that the time frame was not appropriate, and that these vaccines are now proven to be utterly ineffective. And more than that, it's causing harm. And I contend that this is also a violation of bodily autonomy, and broadly speaking, it's a violation of fundamental human rights. I think those who were responsible for what they did to us must be held accountable. And I hope that criminal charges can be in the future laid against these people, because what they did is unconstitutional and border criminality as well.
Is that your view also, Gabriel?
Yes, it definitely is my view. And as Augusto indicated, we have written a book about it in which this and other ideas are discussed in some great detail. I would also like to add that during the last couple of years, doctors have been vilified by the elites, thereby affecting the relationship between the doctor and the patients, which is based on contract and trust. And moreover, during the last couple of years, alternatives medicines, which may have been useful in the fight against COVID, were not allowed to be used by medical doctors. If they were to use those medicines, they would be deregistered. What we have seen in the last couple of years is a period of oppression, suppression, the demonization of medical doctors, and it was a climate of fear in which we lived. And I hope that will never again happen in the future in Australia, which arguably claims to be a model of a democratic state in the world.
I believe that there was a total culture of fear.
Yes.
An exploitation of fear within the community that overrode common sense and human rights. That's just my opinion. Mm-hmm. And I got into terrible trouble for asking the question. Professor Moens, you actually said, did you lose pre-selection? Of course I did. They said it was for my age, but clearly they hated the stand that I took from the very beginning on the vaccines, so-called vaccines, and the mandates, and the experimental nature of those things, and the fact that there were claims made that proved not to be true. Now, yes. How do we walk this back? Because I don't want to be out there saying it was the doctor's fault, it was the medical people's fault, it was this fault. We don't know. People were doing what they thought was the right thing, the best thing. Really, I want to know how we walk that back and get people back on the bandwagon of human rights, truth, doing the right thing.
Well, clearly we have to implement religiously the rights that Australians are supposed to possess in this country. I know we don't have a Bill of Rights, and I hope we will never have a Bill of Rights, because a Bill of Rights would give power to the unelected judges to make decisions about the lives of people, and that is not necessarily a good thing. But there are rights which are embedded in the common law and go back hundreds of years. You may call it part of the natural law, whatever, but there are rights and they have to be respected in a democratic country. If not, we can hardly state that we are part of the democratic countries of the world. But Mr. Broadbent, you have also mentioned something very interesting, or at least you have implied something very interesting. Namely, that there was an expectation that everybody in society would conform to the standards which were set for us by the elites, by the trendsetters. Conformity is one of these concepts that was pushed relentlessly as from 2020 until very recently, and probably still is. When you come to think of it, Australia is a very much a conformist society. How many people would be able or willing, to be even involved in an interview like the one that we are involved in at the moment? How many people would be willing to speak up publicly? How many academics, and there are many of them in Australian universities, would be able or willing or would dare to make comments which are critical of government policy, especially with regard to human rights? And what we have seen is that those institutions, the job of which it is to protect human rights, to foster human rights, were spectacularly quiet during the last 4 or 5 years.
I think
Talking about the Human Rights Commission.
I think they spectacularly failed us. Spectacularly failed us. With the sign behind them says, this is not about human rights. This is about a health issue.
So in other words, as soon as somebody claims, that the health of people is affected, then suddenly all the rights, could be thrown out of the window. They don't count anymore. Obviously, in a free democratic society, there are many goals which we want to achieve, and we want to balance one principle against another principle, and we have to reach an acceptable accommodation. In this case, there was no accommodation because the government went full out in favor of the protection of the health. They didn't even do that, as we now know, because many people were hurt and damaged, and their livelihood and their health has been affected tremendously. Clearly, we have to protect the human rights, and of course, we also have to protect the health of people, but we have to reach a reasonable, sensible, intelligent accommodation between these two important goals that we have in society.
And we have to bear in mind that the government was probably the main agent of misinformation during this period. We know very well that the social media outlets didn't act on its own, and that the Morrison government was instructing Facebook, Twitter, and other outlets to be exercising censorship of those who actually had a better answer to the crisis. What they did is absolutely appalling. Lots of people of goodwill tried to alert us about these problems, offering alternative methods to deal with the crisis, and they were completely and utterly persecuted. Some of these characters lost their jobs, and I really much feel that we lived under a totalitarian regime during those days. The Premier of Western Australia behaved as a deranged dictator. The way that he referred to the population is simply unacceptable. He used terms such as people having to grow their brains, people having mental issues if they do not follow the guidelines that were imposed on them. They lost their jobs, they lost their livelihoods. I guess that there are some of these people who are no longer amongst us because they might have taken their lives.
And
Lots
they
of
lost their
divorces, lots of
they lost
family
their
breakdowns, unacceptable behavior. I hope and I pray that one day these people can be brought to account because what they did was criminal.
Well, you're both lawyers. Quite often people come to me and say, we should have citizen decision making, whereby if you get so many petitioners, we can have a citizens' court and decide on what should happen in Australia. That type of thing, anyway. And I've said to them, if that had been the case during COVID, people like me would have been hung at the end of the street.
Yes. Well, look, we have to also consider that apart from the federal tier of government, where there is a written and rigid constitution, the state constitutions are entirely flexible, and the states can actually do whatever they want under the principle or doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. So, in my opinion, there is indeed room for constitutional reforms. I would like to see more accountability. I would like to see more separation of powers. And I don't think the Westminster model, as it currently works, is actually serving as well, even because the governments have now taken the opportunity to legislate via executive fiat. They use emergency powers. And of course, the emergency powers can be justified on any grounds whatsoever. That was the same tactic used by Adolf Hitler to actually keep the Weimar Constitution. Every time we have an emergency, then the excuse can be given that fundamental rights and freedoms must be somehow not respected. And Daniel Andrews was one of those who actually said that we were actually talking too much about human rights and that it would be better to forget it because in the name of protecting us and keeping us safe, no right whatsoever needs to be respected. I lived and I feel very upset and even traumatized to this very day in a state that closed its borders even to the other states. I actually lost my second job that I had in Sydney because I was forbidden to cross the borders. I stayed 2 years in this rather comfortable concentration camp called Western Australia. And, you know, to be frank with you, it's not so much that I wouldn't expect the ruling classes to do what they did, but I must say that I was very disappointed with my fellow citizens in Western Australia when they started to support the behavior of these dictators, since, of course, they were believing in the narrative of these oppressing ruling classes. So we have to wake up. We have to be doing better. And I think one of the consequences of what we envisaged or faced, let us say, in Australia was a belief, almost a worship of government that never leads to a good outcome. As history tells us that we have to be vigilant because the price of liberty is indeed eternal vigilance.
Gentlemen, if the Amish were living here in Australia in a large group, what would we have done to them? Because their rejection in America, and it's proved that they haven't had anywhere near the problems that the general population have had through the Amish community. Anyway, having said that, I've taken a lot of your time today, and I want to ask you this, and we ask all our guests this. If you were speaking to the Prime Minister today, professors, give me a short statement on what you would say to them.
I would say to the Prime Minister, get out of your office and let somebody else do the job, because on the basis of what they have done to the people, they don't deserve to be in power. Unfortunately, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Basically, I would tell him or her that common sense should be reinstituted. What has happened during the last couple of years is not just incompatible with the Constitution, with the law in general, but is a violation of elementary principles of common sense. We all know that common sense, of course, is uncommon, but if you are a leader and you look after the people of Australia, you are supposed to possess a modicum of common sense. I would also tell the Prime Minister that if it is impossible for him to act accordingly, that people probably have the right to civil disobedience, that is, to disobey a valid law, because the valid law is incompatible with the higher principles, whether they are religious principles or natural law principles, and people would be entitled to violate that law in order to achieve social change. Basically, I would tell the Prime Minister that we need to respect rights in this particular country. We have to balance the rights with other goals which are equally as important. And if we can't do that, we are indistinguishable from any totalitarian state on this planet, and there are many of them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly free speech is a precondition for the realization of a democratic life. So if we do not have the right to exercise free speech and have our opinions disseminated in the public realm, I must say that Australia has ceased to be a functional democracy. So this whole thing about censoring speech means that we are becoming a nation of serfs or slaves. No society can claim to be democratic and under the rule of law if some people can have more rights than others. So the whole approach taken by the Prime Minister and his government, I must say, is not compatible with a truly functional democracy. So I must say also that Professor Moens is quite right to say that if that is so, he is in violation of a higher standard in a democratic environment, which demands that certain rights and freedoms must be necessarily protected. So a government that violates these principles actually acts unlawfully. And we have, as Professor Moens puts it very well, a lawful right to resist. I must say that civil disobedience is perfectly valid when the government acts in an arbitrary or tyrannical fashion. And what I see of the Labour Party is this sort of behavior. I think the Prime Minister behaves as a dictator, and we must respond accordingly.
Gentlemen, couldn't thank you more for giving me the time today. I hope we can talk again. I will keep reading your articles like millions of others around the world, and I thank you for your contribution to this nation, Australia. I thank you for your contribution to free speech, and I thank you for your common sense. For common sense, as you said, Professor, is uncommon.
How true.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.